Hello, and thank you for joining today's 5 Myths of Email Marketing webinar with BlueHornet's very own VP of Strategic Services, Kara Trivunovic. BlueHornet is an email service provider that gives over 2,200 clients the freedom to reach their greatest potential with our combination of global expertise and innovative technology. Email marketing today is arguably one of the most effective digital marketing channels in the marketing landscape. It's highly targeted, customizable, trackable, and can directly drive site traffic to increase revenue. On today's webinar, we'll be joined by Kara Trivunovic as she debunks the 5 most persistent myths that prevent companies from getting the most out of their email program. As BlueHornet's Vice President of Strategic Services, Kara is a driving force for developing strategic direction and client plans rooted in industry and client data. She has become a fixture at email, digital, and direct marketing events and in industry publications nationwide. Welcome, Kara.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for taking the time out of your day to discuss the myths about email marketing. As we look at the email space, it really has continued to mature and evolve over the last decade and a half or so. And I've been fortunate enough to actually be an active participant in it, from its kind of inception as a true marketing channel. So I've had the opportunity to see a lot of evolution around, the conversation that happens about email and what the best practices are. And it's just funny to, continue to hear kind of the continued perception that it's just email, just email continues. And, as I have the opportunity to talk to new people who enter this space from other digital marketing channels and other marketing channels in general, it isn't uncommon to hear them say that. They start to get into an email program, and the common kind of feeling is, I had no idea it was sending email was just so involved, right? I just thought it was email. And I mean, conceptually, sending email really should be easy enough, but the reality is that doing it right, whatever that means for any given brand, isn't as easy as it sounds. And so we hear these stories about how effective email is as a channel, and as with any good thing comes a whole lot of myths and mistruths and misinformation. And so we really wanted to take the time today to review 5 common myths, and there are plenty. Trust me when I tell you, I hear them all the time. But we really wanted to bring to light and have an open conversation about some that we see most commonly. And then at the end, we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. So, just go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, and we'll be asking or answering those questions at the end of the session. So, I just want to thank you again for all of your time today, and we'll go ahead and jump into this. So, as we look at the first myth, right, it's this idea of, and it's just going to sound really funny coming from me because I've been quoted as an email snob. I'm a purist when it comes to the channel. But there's this idea that sending too many email to your customers is going to irritate them. And this is a comment or a statement that I have heard in repeated client meetings time and time again. And it's always said with the best intentions, right? It's typically the email marketing manager who is sitting in the room trying to defend to their senior management why we shouldn't just send another email. And there's a true sense of responsibility that email marketing managers feel when it comes to over-sending or over-targeting or over-communicating with their customer base. And the dynamic in the room is often met with this kind of sense of annoyance from their executive management team that believes that just sending more email is a mantra that they can live by and will drive more revenue for them. And while common sense tells you that, sending too much email, as well as too much of anything is bound to get, irritating or bad, the myth or the fallacy of all of this comes from what we define as too much. What is too much email? What are too many email? So, and like I said, even too much of a good thing can be bad, and so you do need to be mindful of what volume you're sending to an individual. But even more importantly, you need to consider the individual themselves. And as we start looking at targeting and segmentation practices, it is possible to over-segment your database. Sometimes you get to a point where you're actually excluding specific recipients from your select criteria that may have or would have engaged with whatever it was you were trying to accomplish, or would have converted, just given the opportunity to do so. But that doesn't mean that you just send full file all the time, every time. It does mean, though, that you have to be mindful of just how targeted your audience has become. So it's easy to say, right? Find the right volume, find the right cadence in which to message to your to your customers. But there's a number of factors that go into considering or determining what the right cadence is, and some of that is really taking the time to look at the relationship you have, with each of the customers that your brand has. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get to this like highly individualized analysis, but as you start looking at cohorts of people inside of your database, you do start to see trends, and you can identify customers who are highly engaged brand advocates, and maybe they've made recent purchases. Customers that are highly engaged tend to be more tolerant of increased cadence. They like to hear from you more often. They are highly engaged with your brand, and they do like to have that high touch as long as it's relevant. That is especially true over a period of time following a recent engagement. That's why welcome series tend to work really well, because it's at a moment of high engagement. Communication around a purchase or a conversion behavior and following that purchase behavior also tend to be very successful, because your customer is highly engaged at that moment in time. And the problem that a lot of brands have is they make this blanket statement that says we're only going to message to our customers twice a week, or some twice a day. The blanket approach to that is not the right way, and that's where the fallacy or the myth comes into play, because some of your customers will be in tune and receptive to more email communication. Others not so much, and that's where you have to really start monitoring the engagement rates of your communications by these cohorts to understand what is the sweet spot for each of your individual customers. So it isn't cadence in and of itself isn't the bullet that is going to solve all of your engagement issues. But if you're monitoring those engagement rates alongside of frequency, it can really help you determine the right volume for an individual to receive. But that doesn't mean that you get to turn a blind eye to ensuring that your content and your subject lines are fresh and varied and personalized to the recipient. So, really looking at cadence alone isn't likely driving list attrition, but over communication coupled with irrelevant content and lackluster information is certainly to do the trick. So as we look at myth number 2, testing. So testing, it is one of those topics that email marketers, all email marketers should be testing. The problem with testing is that we don't always do it right. And I work with a number of brands, or have worked with a number of brands in the past, that when it comes to testing, they only want to test a really small % of their list. But the reality is that doing these very small tests isn't necessarily going to demonstrate the effectiveness of that test or the effectiveness of your messaging. So as we look at this, email is one of those channels that still, as Julie said at the beginning, still maintains such a high ROI. And because of that, a lot of email marketers are very reluctant to do a lot of testing. There's this mentality that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so, they don't really want to start messing with their program, because, it's already doing well for them. Their open rates are above industry averages. Their conversion rates are good. They're driving good revenue, year-over-year lift. And those are all good things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's what we're all striving to do. But because of that momentum, and because of those metrics and those data points, there is very little foreshadowing done to say how much better could I make this, and doing a lot of testing is what answers those questions. And so, when the idea of testing does come into play, because, every marketer, every email marketer especially, hears this all the time. You should always be testing something. But many marketers will only want to test a small portion of their overall sending environment. which is understandable. I mean, they worry about, a test being unsuccessful and, maybe declining the opportunity for a conversion and seeing that was missed. But, doing a test one time to 10% of your list or your database does not, produce a meaningful and a statistically viable result. So, the idea of looking at larger test groups or even, God forbid, holding out a control group, and I emphasize that because very few marketers will actually hold out a control group. And holding out a control group is, it is one of those things that marketers, especially direct marketers and direct mail marketers, have been doing for decades. Is, how do those who did receive my communication perform against those who didn't? And it's this whole idea of being able to measure incremental attribution and incremental revenue. Because a lot of us as email marketers, we're generating revenue that may have likely happened already, and without holding out those control groups, you don't really know that. But people are reluctant to do it because suppressing a portion of your audience for the purposes of learning isn't always a desirable path. But there's so much that can be learned by doing that and really testing larger audiences over longer periods of time. Because depending on what you're testing, one test to a small audience isn't necessarily going to tell the story that you're looking to find, or the truth that you're looking to find. The point really here is that when it comes to testing, less isn't always more. All right, so this is funny. Following email marketing best practices will not yield the best results for your program. So having been, like I said, in this space for 15 plus years and really building strategies and email channel approaches for customers for a majority of that time, saying that following email marketing best practices isn't necessarily the right way to go is kind of a funny thing coming from me. But anybody who's ever worked with me knows that I have this a bit of a rub when it comes to best practices and benchmarks, because the reality is that what's best for one brand may not be best for another. And if everybody followed all of the same best practices and we all did the same thing, with our email programs, there's nothing interesting about that. It would get boring very quickly for all of our customers and our subscribers. And so, best practices, benchmarks are a part of this conversation too. They're a good rule of thumb. They're leveraged as kind of guiding principles. These aren't jail cell walls, right? I mean, the idea behind best practices is that, you really need to figure out what is going to work best for your customer base. And there are so many factors that go into that. What is the tenure of the relationship with your customer? What is the value of your brand to the customer in this space? What is that level of loyalty? How long have your subscribers been on your file? I mean, there are so many things that go into this that just following best practices around how long or how wide your email communication should be, or how many characters you should have in the subject line. All of those things they're guiding posts. That's nothing more. The most successful program that I ever had the opportunity to work on broke every best practice ever. And the client was extremely reluctant to try and push the bounds and step outside the comfort zone of what best practices were. And so I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with a brand that would give us a little leeway and let us kind of play a little bit with the way we presented content inside of their communication. Clearly, within brand guidelines. But, what we did with them was, we kind of put together, 3 versions of the message. So one was followed every best practice, right? Message width, the image to content ratios, subject line, use of navigation, take your pick. I mean, number of lines of copy. We followed every best practice, and that was the message they were comfortable with, right? I mean, it was what they were used to seeing. It was, the the presentation in the format that was just that was comfortable for them. It was a known entity, and they were really comfortable in those conversations. We put together kind of a hybrid that was largely best practice driven, but was also kind of started pushing the bounds a little bit. Had a little heavier imagery than they were comfortable with. We used a few more colors that weren't necessarily in their brand palette but were complementary. And then we did a version of the message that broke every rule. I mean, every best practice rule, we broke it. Length, width, file size, use of imagery. I mean, everything. We down to the point that we didn't even include a call to action in the communication. And when we sent that out, we actually did do full file testing. We did a three-way split. And we tested it over the course of multiple months so that we could actually get some meaningful information. And what we found was, the hypothesis was, as we started moving through this, that the version B of the message, kind of that hybrid version, was going to be what was most prominently effective. But what we found was that the version that broke every best practice not only outperformed the other two communications, both from an engagement, a conversion, and a revenue perspective, but it outperformed every other promotional communication they sent in their portfolio, which was amazing because there was no call to action in the communication, but it generated the highest revenue for any program that they sent. So, that isn't what's going to happen for everybody, right? I mean, that isn't necessarily the way that this works for every email marketer. But I share that story because, there's an opportunity for you to aspire to do something different, and others have seen success in that approach. And so really being able to look beyond what the basic best practices of email are and looking at, how is it your customer wants to engage with you. Really just don't be afraid to push the boundaries. And I think the point here is that it's important to have guiding posts, but you should develop them for your organization. What works best for your customers, and where are you seeing the most success? And that's across the board when you look at best practices in general. All right, so as we go to number 4, there's a number of best practices out there, and creative balance between text and imagery tends to be one of those things that is, again, heavily talked about, partially because it was a big component to spam filtering. So, way back when there was this, as you look at the spam houses of the world, they definitely looked at the analysis of what was your image to text ratio. And it would attribute a spam score. But as more and more visually aesthetically pleasing kind of communications and heavier imagery-based communications have come out, that balance is a little less important. So as you look at kind of the evolution of this, air quotes, myth, historically it had been important for spam scoring. And then historically, as that evolved, it was important for image suppression purposes. So because, most inbox providers were suppressing imagery by default, you wanted to be able to communicate as much of your message as possible without image suppression. But as more and more inbox providers are now displaying images by default, this also becomes less important. And so, there are certainly some best practices around, how you leverage imagery inside of your communications. I mean, using alt tags and, things like that. And there are other situations where leveraging text-based email communications are much more effective. So, as you really start to look at the purpose of your program, and some of it is really driven by how you want to portray your brand and what is that brand presence that you have in the inbox. Having text-based, largely text-based communications isn't necessarily a bad thing either. And so, finding the right combination of how much content do you want to share inside of the email communication versus, do you want to drive them someplace else, or is there someplace else you want, them to go to read further content, you have the ability to kind of experiment with this a little bit and finding that right kind of mix. And what I find a lot of times with brands is that it isn't about finding a specific formula that works just right for this and sticking with it. What gets customers engaged is the variety, and you don't want things to be so far off base from communication to communication that it's unrecognizable, right, from one message to the next. But you do want to avoid this this possibility of becoming visual wallpaper to a subscriber. So using the same static subject line all the time, or having the same static layout, or using the same amount of copy and imagery and placement all the time can also cause some level of disengagement. And so the formula is a varied formula, and you need to constantly be trying different things and looking at different ways that you can present information, and that part of that is really finding a good balance between text and images. I know I've seen a number of statistics and reports around avoiding anything more than 4 lines of copy in succession when you're putting together an email communication. And while that tends to work, and it tends to be a good rule of thumb, again, this goes back to the best practices conversation, but tends to be a good rule of thumb, but isn't necessarily always the right formula. And so I just, as I work with a number of brands who get very caught up on some of these things, it's just important to remember that you have the opportunity to play with this a little bit, and the best practice for imagery and balance and text isn't necessarily always the only answer. So as you start looking at design and layout and your need to communicate, I think what's important here is that you have something relevant to say. It's about making sure that what it is that you're presenting to your customers is going to resonate with them, and you can do that with imagery, you can do that with text, you can do it with a combination of them all. As other content types become more actionable for brands, being able to pull in video or Twitter feeds, or it's really just about finding the right content for the people that you're sending to. And so I encourage you to have something important to say in your email communications, and be focused on that, not on do I have the right balance of text to images, because it isn't as important as people would like to potentially place that opportunity or place that level of importance on. So I want to go ahead and move on to myth 5, and then as I said, go ahead and be keying in any questions, any myths that you potentially want to debunk or ask questions about as we move through this, because we're getting to about the bottom of the hour at the 12:30 mark Central, 10:30 Pacific, and wanted to be able to leave enough time to have you guys submit your questions and get them answered. So because myths are always a fun topic of conversation. So the last myth before we kind of open this up for questions is really looking at the idea that all emails need to be short and to the point. So we've come full cycle really as an email marketing kind of discipline. I remember when I started in this space, email communications were pretty long, right? It was really newsletter-esque. Consumers did not want to be sold to by brands in email communications. They were really meant for information sharing and gathering, and so newsletters tended to be what it was that people were sending, and they were long. I mean, they would scroll for pages and pages and pages. And I mean, there's one brand I worked with that found that when their email scrolled 7 pages or 7 screens, that they had higher engagement than if they were small and short and concise. And so really being able to, again, play with what the right length of your communication is important. So as we kind of look at the evolution of this, right, we've moved from 15 plus years ago as kind of a communication vehicle for sharing information. We moved into this promotional kind of monster, right, where all of our email communications are very promotionally driven. They have to have ROI. They have to have revenue associated with them, even if in some instances the message isn't intended to drive revenue. It was informational or editorial in nature. And so we've got, you have those kind of promotional focus. And what happened when we moved to that promotional kind of focus was we went from newsletter format to kind of postcard-esque format, right? Things got smaller. They got a little more concise. As we moved to a more mobile, mobile-focused environment, things get even smaller and more concise, and buttons get bigger, words get fewer. But that isn't necessarily always the right answer. And so, again, this goes back to the quality of the content, regardless of the length of the message. You need to make sure that your email communications contain the proper elements and the pieces of information you need to convey and share. One of the great things about, especially when you look at brands that have need to include a lot of content. So if you think about flash sale brands or partner environments, I see this a lot in travel and hospitality with airlines and hotels. There's a need to feature content, and some of it can run very lengthy, and some of that is contractual obligation. And so, as much as the email marketing manager may want to shorten things up, the opportunity to do so is limited. But just because you have to share all of the same content doesn't necessarily mean that it all has to be shared in the same way. And so, you do have opportunities to create different hierarchies and visual interests as you look at running the length of those communications and being able to restructure messages dynamically based on whether or not somebody has demonstrated interest in a certain brand or a certain product line or a piece of content that you can highlight at the top for that individual that could be different for someone else. So as you look at how you manage the length of your email communications, really being able to define and understand what it is you're trying to accomplish, how much information is really necessary, and where do you hit that point of overkill. So, in this example, again, shorter isn't always better. Sometimes there are certain situations where you just need to have more content, and that's okay. So, as you look at, the best practices around this and how long messages should run, don't get too caught up in it. Clearly I'm not saying that you just, send 17-page long email communications. Not necessarily going to be the most ideal, but not uncommon. I have seen it happen, and I've seen brands that have great success with it. So it isn't a hard and fast rule, I think is the point here, and it's something that you really can play around with and test. All right, so as we kind of look at those 5 high-level, email marketing myths, and like I said, there are plenty more, but it's really just kind of, I want you guys to all walk away from this today with the sense that you can push the boundaries, and that it isn't just because you read it online doesn't make it true. As subject matter experts, myself included, and others in the space, right? We share our experiences, and we bring to light what we've seen work for other brands. And I think it's really important that as you read anything out there about the space, that it's important to take into consideration that what is being said is interesting information, was very beneficial for whatever brand was participating or benefited from, or group of brands that may have seen some sense of a cohort of performance. It's important to remember that you doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a truth for you. Could absolutely be a myth in this space. And so, as you look at these 5, really start considering, where you have the opportunity to debunk some of these myths inside of your organization, and really just, continue to drive for the best email program you can. Best practices kind of be damned. So with that, I want to go ahead and hand it over to Julie to get to your questions and answer whatever you guys want to know.
Thank you, Kara. That was great. We are going to go over some of these great questions that we got in. Please send any other questions or myths that you want to try to have Kara debunk while we're going through these. So the first question is there a number of emails per day or per week that really is just too much to be sending?
Oh, gosh. So, I mean, honestly, the challenge is, in answering that question, the challenge is that it really does depend. So, there are situational considerations you have to make. So if you sent a promotional message today and potentially an editorial communication, and then someone made a purchase and they got their purchase confirmation, and it really does depend on what the makeup of those communications are. I have seen a number of clients do a lot of testing around this to determine what's right, and quite honestly, it really does depend and vary both by the situation and the moment in time, as well as the level of engagement that a customer has. So I can tell you that I've recently seen a couple brands that were sending 15 and 18 messages a week to their customers, and they were seeing attrition in their engagement rate. So that's probably too much. But there are other brands who if you set expectations appropriately with the customer, daily deal sites do this a lot. You're going to get these messages daily. Sometimes you're going to get them twice daily. The customer knows what they're getting into. I've seen other brands that have actually, as you go through their preference center and you make certain selects and say this is the type of information and content I want to get, it'll tell you at the end of your preference, at the end of the preference center that you're going to get 32 messages a week from us, and it gives you at least the opportunity to go back and edit your selects so that you can reduce that frequency if you want to. So, I think you have to listen to the signals, from your customer base, monitor your engagement rates to determine what is the right number for your brand.
Great, thank you. Next question, what percentage of a list should be designated to your control group? Are there specific subscriber attributes we should be looking for to define the control group, or is it truly random, like a 50-50 split?
Yep, so your control group should be a random representation of your database, unless you're doing specific testing in a specific subsegment of your database, and it should be representative of that. The size is really, really kind of determined by, by the size of your send. So, depending on how many people you have in your database or how many people you're sending to, I've seen, a 1%, holdout be a statistically viable sample set. In other cases, 10% 10% tends to be a pretty good rule of thumb for a holdout of a control group. But like I said, it should be, it should be a random select. And then depending on what you're testing or, what you're kind of looking at, sometimes it's beneficial to, once you've defined the control group, to maintain it. So that you can then determine long-term impact of messaging over time. And so it's a really good way to understand the value of an email address or the value of email communication to your customer base, and it helps you determine what the incremental lift is for those who receive email from you versus those who don't.
Okay. In regards to the client you mentioned that kind of broke industry best practices and had an effective email that was a much longer email, can you provide specifics on what industry that was in? And then in regards to that also, are there generalities that an industry doing this with their email is more effective than the other, a different industry doing that with their email?
Yeah, so sure. So it was a retail client, has brick and mortar and e-commerce kind of presence, and kind of a large home goods type of brand. It was, as you look at kind of the best practices approach versus where we broke out, I think it was for them it was an interesting kind of approach because we actually took a lot of influence from other channels, right? So what we wanted to do is kind of step away from what works specifically well for retail and what are we seeing from a lot of retail marketers, and let's completely turn it upside down and try something else. And so we had actually had the opportunity to also be simultaneously working with a large publishing organization that had seen a lot of success in kind of an approach that they took this very and this has been a few years back, but took this very like online magazine kind of feel to their publications, and we wanted to test how that would translate into a different industry. And so it worked well for the publisher because that was kind of what people expected from a publisher. But when we translated that and borrowed from other industries and implemented that in a retail environment, it was wildly successful for them because at the time people weren't really seeing that type of content from a retailer. So I think it's as you look at where you have the opportunity or you can find inspiration for stepping outside of that box a little bit, sometimes it's a really great idea to start looking at what other industries are doing and what do you like about how other industries are approaching email, and finding ways that you can align that with your industry, because we spend a lot of time really kind of monitoring what our competitors are doing, and really close-knit competitors as well as those that kind of extend beyond beyond our industry or vertical a little bit. But I mean, sometimes the best inspiration can come from the most unexpected places. And so, I think that was kind of part of the fun when we were building that program out, was that we really were looking at what we saw successful elsewhere in completely disparate industries, and then figuring out a really interesting way to apply that to that vertical.
Great. What would you say is the best way to capture and then aggregate all of the email best practices and benchmarking that is out there? Are there any publications or resources you would recommend just as a starting point for a marketer?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so much information out there. I was actually just having this conversation with a new employee the other day. You have to take everything that you read out there with a grain of salt. I mean, you can Google email marketing best practices and come up with content and information from a variety of sources. Analysts, third-party publishing organizations, other email service providers, and there is some level of truth and interest in all of it, but like I said, I mean, you had to take all of that information with a little bit of a grain of salt, and make sure that it's not just something that's taken at face value. As you start looking at, I mean, there are a number of organizations that have really great information about the channel. ClickZ has a great email marketing blog. Media Post does as well. So if you look at like Email Insider on Media Post, they also have Social Insider and some other digital marketing verticals. It's really interesting. They typically have really good contributors and pretty good information that comes out of there. Marketing Sherpa and the EEC, Email Experience Council, also have good information and some pretty good case studies there. Depending on the size of your organization, if you have access to Forrester research, they typically have some pretty good content that's all third-party, analyst type of information. So there's some good detail there. And then it doesn't hurt to kind of see what's on the blogs from various email service providers. I mean, they've got us and others have all kinds of great information on the site, and we post on our Digital River blog, and there are other locations that you can get good content. So it's a mass, right? I mean, you can get so much information and so much detail about email best practices these days. Like I said, it's just a good idea to kind of take it all with a little bit of a grain of salt, and remember that a lot of the people publishing content, some of them have been practitioners before, and have been the person that has to hit the send button on an email, and they have some very good experience there. Others haven't. So it's just like I said, it's good to kind of remember the direction in which that information is coming.
Okay. From your experience with the brands you've worked with, should send time optimization be considered a myth or a good guidepost?
Yeah, so there is, so since the day that, anybody has published stats about the best day of the week to send email, it instantly becomes the worst day of the week to send email. But I mean, as you look at send time optimization on an individualized basis, I think that it's still something that not a lot of brands have embraced. It's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to accomplish, but it can be very, very effective. So as you look at, the behavior, if you're looking at it at the behavior of it at an individualized level, right? So, and again, looking at it consistently over a period of time. So just because I opened my messaging today at, 4 a.m. Pacific because I happen to be traveling and I'm not in time zone and, my life is, I can't sleep when I'm out here. The reality of my everyday behavior could be that I open my email, more in the evening when I'm home and taking it easy. So, you have to kind of, look at a period of time and optimize against a longer tail of data to say, okay, on average, Kara opens email at 8:30 p.m. and she tends to open it from, her iPad and, whatever the case may be, right? But it is important to look at that trend data over a period of time, because everybody's lives get busy and none of us, are like setting our schedules to say, okay, I have to send up my email now. So life happens, people get busy. It's not always going to be the optimal time to send an email communication, but it is directionally a very valuable statistic to understand and optimize against. That being said, I don't necessarily believe that, and I don't have a lot of supporting data to defend my stance here, so take that with a grain of salt. It's just a kind of an opinion, but from what I have seen, a little bit that I have seen, just like varying subject lines and varying layout, varying the time of day that you send email communications is also a good way to increase interest. If you get used to seeing the same thing in your email box at the same time every day, sure, it can set some expectations and create a pattern of behavior, but that pattern it definitely has an end time, and at some point in time, people are just going to start overlooking it. So there is an opportunity, I think, to leverage send time optimization for some of your email communications, and then be more be a little more open to sending other communications at different times. So it kind of gives you the sense that everything's not on a schedule, and when that happens, a lot of consumers start to believe that there's something less personal about it. Like, I get this email at the same time every day regardless of what's going on. And that can feel very programmed and automated, and it probably is, the reality. But you want it to really feel like a personal relationship, not something that you've set and, like the idea of set it and forget it. So.
Great. That concludes today's Q&A.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. If you have any additional questions that you'd like answered from today's topic or anything on BlueHornet in general, please email us at bluehornetcommunications@bluehornet.com. We will be sending out the recording of this webinar as well as the slides that were presented in the next coming days. So have a wonderful rest of your week.